Amigos de Informe Púrpura, ¿cómo están? Espero que estén muy bien el día de hoy. Hoy tenemos un invitadazo, una persona muy especial con nosotros, una persona que pues básicamente es uno de los mejores creadores de contenido, en verdad, de los Vikings en habla inglesa. Aquí tenemos a Luke Braun. Luke, si no lo conocen, es una persona que se dedica a cubrir a los Vikings en su canal de Locked On Vikings. Hace videos casi diario. También tiene un canal en una plataforma que se llama Patreon. Ahí es donde hace un poco más de análisis en seco sobre algunas situaciones en específico. También tiene videos gratis por si buscan apoyarlo en esta plataforma, y también ha escrito algunos artículos en una página que se llama Zone Coverage. Pero bueno, antes de empezar con esta gran transmisión, pues es un gusto saludar a Marcelo, a Pablo. ¿Cómo están, amigos?
¿Cómo están, muchachos? Buenas noches.
Muy bien, amigo.
Aquí listos,
Qué bueno.
encantados de tener a Luke.
Qué bueno, perfecto. Pues un día un poquito caluroso, pero hablando un poquito más del stream, pues para términos de el stream, vamos a hablar en inglés, evidentemente. Así que pues vamos a tratar de poner los subtítulos una vez que ya el video esté subido. Pero bueno, hey Luke, how you doing?
Hey, thanks for speaking English.
We know it's a little bit difficult for you to speak in Spanish, so we're going to start speaking in English.
I could probably piece most of it together, but yeah, that's probably best for...
Do you have any experience speaking Spanish?
I learned what a lot of Americans learn in high school, and I live in LA, so I picked up some osmosis, but I wouldn't say I could speak. I could probably keep up in a conversation, but it would be really, really hard. Like someone would have to be holding my hand.
Okay. So fortunately, we speak English fluently. So we will start with some questions about the Vikings offseason. So could you please tell us about some of your thoughts of the Vikings offseason so far?
Sure. I think the whole direction of it, this is really an offseason where they're lining themselves up to move on from Kirk Cousins, whether that's next year or the year after. I think depends on how drafts go and how, what succession plan at quarterback they can actually pull the trigger on. They have, of course, declined to extend Kirk Cousins. They just restructured his contract to get his cap hit down this year, but they didn't actually commit new years to his deal. That's pretty significant. They have lined themselves up to, I think, trade up. They're probably pretty willing to use next year's first round pick to trade up in this draft if the right quarterback falls. But that's a huge if. And if that quarterback doesn't fall, I think they also have a fairly smooth option available to them that can set them up to be in the same exact position next year, where they can add a year to Kirk Cousins' deal, spread out some of that dead cap a little bit too. That helps, but mostly it's have Kirk Cousins in the building going into the draft. That's what they want. They don't want to commit to many years of him, but they do want him in the building going into the draft just in case they don't get that quarterback. But sooner rather than later, the next guy that Kwesi and Kevin O'Connell actually chose will be in the building. And I think it's just a matter of trying to maneuver things so that they can swiftly get to that point. And I think that is why you've seen them be fairly conservative. That's why I think you've seen them be very deliberate with which dead cap hits they're taking and which dead cap hits they are trying to spread out, which contracts they backload. They want to kind of have the option. But I think once that quarterback is in place this year, next year, whenever that happens, I think we'll see a much clearer vision of the roster shakeout.
Okay. So did you like some of the moves they made? Because you upload a video talking about the Shanahan scheme and also the McVay scheme. So do you think, or do you like these moves, like the Josh Oliver move, maybe the approach this offense is going to?
I'm still working to understand them, and not in a way of I don't get it because I don't like it, but in a way of they are clearly going toward more Shanahan side schematic plays and away from the McVay side, which is not that different. This is a tweak, not an overhaul. But I don't understand the Shanahan side quite well enough to really be able to say whether I like that or not. For now, I'm just trying to get a feel for it. That said, that's like extending CJ Ham, signing Josh Oliver. That tells me what direction they're going, and I need to go learn about what that means. I do love the Byron Murphy signing, though. The rest of them, Dean Lowry, bringing back Madison, bringing back Bradbury, I'm very neutral on. Like, they're small. I kind of don't care. Other things would have been fine. That's fine. I don't think it's going to be where the season lives or dies. But I like the Byron Murphy signing for whatever that's worth. I think some other things are, I could nitpick about, they could have paid that guy maybe $500K less, or they could have gone out and gotten another guy or something. But so far, the one real signing that they've made, I'm a big fan of.
Okay, so Marcelo, Pablo, do you have any questions for Luke in these terms of the offseason?
No, just comment that Quincy and O'Connell say when they arrive to the team that they are going to make a rebuilding, a competitive rebuild, if I'm not wrong. I think the last season was like the competitive one, and this one is going to be the rebuilding one. We have moved from all players like Kendricks, Thielen. We are making short contracts for 1 year, 2 year, making the team or giving the team some flexibility in the next years. So, what do you think about this next season? Look like it's going to be like that, rebuilding, or they are going to try to compete a little bit?
Yeah. So I think a lot of people missed it because they commented on this, but it happened like 2 days after they lost the playoff game. And I don't think a lot of people wanted to watch a Vikings press conference right after they lost to the Giants. But they addressed that exactly. And they said, okay, last year was the competitive rebuild. That was the year where we're bringing in guys like Jordan Hicks and Zadarius Smith, and we're trying to kind of transition away from what the last guys were doing, build our own version of the Vikings, but we want to stay competitive while doing so. We won 13 games. We won the division. We did that. We stayed competitive. Didn't go as far in the playoffs as we would have wanted to. But now they have replaced the phrase competitive rebuild. That is out of their lexicon now with championship standard. So I think that's your answer. They are considering this year as legitimate as any year. They are not doing the Bears. They're not doing the Panthers. They're not doing the, let's just kind of take our foot off the gas for a couple years, amass some assets. We'll worry about contending later. No, they're going to try to make the best team that they possibly can. Like I said, with the quarterback situation, that is something you can't exactly rush, right? You have to sort of pick your spot and be very deliberate about who you make your next quarterback. And you have to tailor the rest of your offseason strategy around being able to pursue that quarterback when the time comes, whether that's a 2024 quarterback, having enough capital to do that. If that's a 2023 quarterback, leaving yourself available to trade up, whatever that is, right? So there will be no talk of rebuild. There will be no talk of, this is kind of just a semi. We'll just kind of float through this year, whatever. We're just getting some. No. They're going for it.
Okay. Starting talking about the draft, we know some of the tendencies of Adolfo Mensa. About the 10-yard split, maybe the drafting players from the Power 5 conferences. So I wanted to ask you if what did you learn from Kwesi from last year's draft? Because we came from Spielman, like from 2012. We already know maybe how predictable he was in the draft. So maybe could you tell us a little bit about what did you learn from Kwesi? And maybe could you predict something? Are you sure something about this draft, maybe?
There is an interesting factor to this that is all the same scouts still work for the Vikings. Kwesi did not bring in his own scouting department. He rolled with the scouting department that Rick Spielman built. And it's now been more than a year. He's had ample time to, bring in his own guys, clear out the department if he wanted to, and he's elected not to. So I think the draft strategy is probably not going to be as crazy different as it usually is when a new GM takes over a team. But I will say this, like you mentioned, the 10-yard split is, I think, it seems like a really big one. Going off of last year's draft, every player had a good 10-yard split, more or less. And that makes a lot of sense on the defense because they wanted players who could see something, read, react, and accelerate very fast. So you want to see how well they run in that 10 yards, that first 10 yards. And plus, imagining a defensive play. How often does a defensive player, especially on like a run play, run more than 10 yards? That's a lot. 20 yards is a lot of space, right? We want to see how fast you are in a practical sense, and that might translate a little better. But it's only one draft. It might have just been a coincidence that all the players that they happen to really, really like were good 10-yard split players. We don't 100% know that that's a tendency. But I think the thing we do know is with trades, we kind of understand with trades that Adolfo Mensa values trading down a lot and will do so even at at poor value, because trading down still you're still probable to win the trade even if you are getting less than you should get. That is his philosophy. And the evidence for that is the Lions Jameson Williams trade last year. That trade, by all accounts of like historical data and stuff, Adolfo Mensa could have gotten more out of that trade, but he agreed to it. And by data of how draft picks tend to work out, the player with picks 32 and 40 or 66 or whatever it was, those picks tend to produce more value than pick 12 does on its own. But people trading from pick 32 to pick 12 typically have to pay more, and they did than the Lions paid. So that tells me what data Adolfo Mensa is using. It shouldn't surprise you, is a lot more analytics focused than it is market focused. It's result focused. I want the picks that will work out better rather than the picks that are at the most sensible price, I guess, if that tracks to you. So that's another thing with Adolfo Mensa, but we are only 1 year in, so it's pretty new and there is a lot that we have left to learn.
So, were you in favor of that trade, the Jameson Williams trade?
I thought the idea of trading down was fine. I was not a huge Jameson Williams fan, and I thought the Lions reached taking him at 12. So allowing the division rival to make that mistake, I think, was good. But I do think that the Lions underpaid, and I think that was a mistake on Kwesi. I don't think it would have been crazy for him to, I think they gave like a third rounder back in that trade or something like that, or a fourth rounder back, like to move those down a round or something like that, to renegotiate that trade so that the Vikings get a little bit more value. Probably could have been done without torpedoing the trade. Of course, it's difficult with the division rival. There's that extra tension to it, so I understand. But that is a small criticism on a move that I would rather they do that move than not. but I also am a little conflicted because I loved Kyle Hamilton, and I really wish they took Kyle Hamilton. He's playing pretty well for the Ravens, and I think that is a guy that is going to make the Vikings regret this. I think more than Jameson Williams. I see there's a Lions fan in the chat
Yes, sir.
that loves him. I'm a little concerned at some of the reports we've heard out of Detroit, some of the quotes we've heard out of Detroit. They don't seem very happy with him, but sophomore year, a lot more can happen. He should hopefully be healthy, so we'll see how it plays out.
So I'm curious to hear that you prefer the Kyle Hamilton pick, because I think personally that he wouldn't be like that good in the Vikings scheme, where maybe his physical traits were not in terms of translating to the professional terms. Maybe that's mine, but do you think maybe in future Luis Sin would be better in a Flores scheme than Hamilton? Comparing that Hamilton maybe could have played in a Flores scheme if he has been chosen by the Vikings.
My memory is a bit fuzzy. You'll have to remind me. My answer to this is which one is better at man coverage. That's what really is going to matter for safeties for Flores' scheme. Which one do you trust more to man cover a tight end is probably going to be the one that is a better fit. But Kyle Hamilton has, I think he has a lot of range because he's really heady and he's doing a lot of reading. I think Flores demands a little bit less mentally from his players than the Fangio Donatel thing, in a good way. A lot less thinking. And that is kind of Kyle Hamilton's strength. So we might be leaning into a world where that wouldn't have been as good. But in the world where they pick Kyle Hamilton instead of Scene, we might not be changing defensive schemes at all. So it's kind of hard to chase that hypothetical.
Yes. Okay, I am going to ask to answer this question. Si tienen que preguntar en inglés o en español, pues pregunten en español y nosotros hacemos la traducción hacia Luke. Igual, Marcelo, Pablo, si ustedes quieren preguntarle algo a Luke, adelante, o sea, para eso estamos,
Si
¿no?
me permites, yo quiero hacer la siguiente pregunta.
Ajá.
Luke, hi. Based on the Salary Smith situation and the recent linked information from Dalvin Cook, do you expect a trade before the draft or in the draft?
With Dalvin Cook?
Or
And also the Darius.
Or Zadarius.
Or both.
Both, yeah. I do not anticipate a Zadarius Smith trade. My read on that situation, which I should be clear, this is not a report. I don't have sources inside the organization. I'm just sort of speculating. With Zadarius Smith is that the Vikings want to sign him to a new contract and an extension. However, the free agency work and the draft work are higher priority things that they have to do first. So I think there will be negotiations with Zadarius Smith after the draft. And if they can come to a deal, then great. And if not, then we talk about trades, but that will be an after the draft thing. With Dalvin Cook, I think that there is a really high likelihood of him getting traded. And I could definitely see that happening on draft weekend. I think if it were to happen before draft weekend, it probably already would have. I just don't really see a reason to wait. I think everything that everybody knows is already set. And I think the next piece of information that will inform this is how the draft board falls. If you're a team that wants Bijan Robinson really bad and you miss out on him, you might become a team that wants to trade for Dalvin Cook. But if you're that team, you're not going to do that until you see that you didn't get Bijan Robinson or whoever. So I could totally see a day 2 or day 3 Dalvin Cook trade. I would prefer a trade to cut, obviously, because you get draft picks back, but also it saves more money. He's got some guaranteed money that would travel in a trade, but would become dead money if he were cut. So that is a preferable option. If I had to guess, I would guess that is a late day 2, early day 3 kind of move. Or perhaps it is part of a greater package to trade up for a quarterback or something. You trade a first round pick this year, a first round pick next year, and Dalvin Cook. And maybe that takes you up just far enough to get that quarterback that you wanted. That would be the dream. But I would guess the weekend. And if not during the draft, then I think Dalvin Cook has a really good chance to stay a Viking.
So talking about the defensive line, do you think that maybe Davenport would play in a 5-tech position, maybe, if Sedarius stays?
Yeah, Brian Flores' defense very often will put 3 edge rush types on the field. And Davenport, as well as Zadarius Smith, are both very good at rushing interior against guards and beating centers. If you can get those guys one-on-one with guards and centers, they have a much greater likelihood of success. Brian Flores' scheme is tailored to do that a lot, to have a guy like Davenport line up at your classic 5-technique edge rusher, stunt to the inside, and then go be one-on-one with a center because of the rest of the way the pass rush is constructed, forcing a one-on-one with the center. You can do that with Davenport or Smith. And if you do that with both, then that's great. It's like having, cake and frosting. We love it.
Okay. Getting something into the draft, I wanted a personal question. Like, what is your best draft experience you have being a Vikings fan?
My best draft experience?
Yes.
Laquan Treadwell would say.
Before it became something that I have to work so hard on that this is no longer worth the effort, watching the draft with my dad, he would come down to LA every year and actually spend the weekend with me, and we would watch the draft together. And then we'd go take a walk. We'd go get lunch. We'd argue about the players we like or we don't like. He would get incredibly mad every time Spielman traded down. I think the funniest year was the year, I think it was when they took Alexander Madison. And I think Spielman traded down 4 separate times in that third round. And he just kept like amassing random 7th round picks and picks next year. And like he just kept on trading down. I thought my dad was going to have a coronary. He was upset, and it's very fun to then to kind of debate with him and well, no, this is why they do that. And, so kind of pick any of the years. I think it had been happening from like 2016 all the way up until I think COVID. We had some really good times watching the draft together.
Okay. Going into some of the prospects, there has been a lot of buzz these days on Will Levis. You have already uploaded a video on Patreon taking an opinion on him, but can you tell us a little bit as a prospect who Will Levis is and if he's going to adapt well in a O'Connell scheme?
For sure, he will adapt well. I think he'll adapt well to any pro scheme. I don't think that he is a particularly scheme-dependent player. I think the thing with Levis that he doesn't have is the ability to respond calmly to pressure. He's a little bit of a panicky guy. But if you can keep him in rhythm and keep him protected, I think you have a really good quarterback with an absolute cannon of an arm. It's very similar to what we have with Kirk Cousins, where if everything works around him and stays on script, you're very rarely going to have critiques. And it's when things go off the rails, when the actual way that the play needs to be made kind of requires some thinking and acting on the fly, that you don't get as good of results. I think the same applies to Will Levis, but Will Levis also has some accuracy issues. And that's why I'm not as big of a fan of Will Levis on the Vikings. I also think Levis is a lot more ready to start than somebody like Anthony Richardson, somebody like these other flyers, the Thompson Robinsons, Hendon Hookers. I think Will Levis can pop in day one and operate some version of a simplified offense that you then fold complexity into as his rookie year goes on. The Vikings don't need that. because they have Kirk Cousins this year, so they don't need to have their rookie start day one. Which is why I really like seeing when Levis is mocked to a team like the Colts. I think the Colts is a great destination for him. Or a team like the Commanders or Buccaneers trading up to get him. I think that's a great result for Will Levis because those teams need a quarterback now. And I think the best thing for Levis is getting under center, getting into the pocket, and getting used to the bullets flying at the NFL speed. Getting used to pressure and defensive linemen coming at him and getting more accustomed and acclimated to that game speed. Here, he'll sit on the bench for a year, which I don't think does him a lot of good. And then he'll have to go learn that sort of instinctive ability to handle pressure a little better. But if he can keep his feet glued down in the pocket, if he can keep his lower half quiet when pressure is coming, he can be a really accurate and successful quarterback. So scheme-wise, he can absolutely make any throw that Kevin O'Connell needs him to make. But situation-wise, I think there are other teams that are going to get more out of him because he can start right away, and some teams need that really bad. We have the luxury of developing someone with maybe a little bit more improvisational talent, even if that means they need a year to develop, because we have that luxury. And that's why I prefer Anthony Richardson.
So,
Look,
sorry.
I just have a question about that. In the QB position, when you draft one QB, do you think it's better to start immediately with that QB or give the prospect like a year in a bench before some guy like Cousins or some veteran QB? Do you think there's a way, or it depends on the prospect?
Definitely depends on the guy. I think for some prospects that are just so raw that the speed of the NFL will immediately overwhelm them, it's best to keep them on the bench, have them play backup quarterback, have them go through week to week, getting used to game plans, getting acclimated to the speed of practice at the NFL level without any pressure. For example, I think Justin Fields needed that. And I think it's really a catastrophic mistake that the Bears couldn't give that to him. I think Patrick Mahomes needed that. That's not a knock for guys that need that. It's just some guys come in a little raw and need to be able to get used to the speed of the NFL before it's time to actually get out there in live action. And I think there are other players who don't need that and who's like Will Levis. His flaw, I think, can only be solved by real live action. And the stuff that he is good at speaks to being able to start right away. Kenny Pickett was the same way. I think he was able to start right away, and that's fine. But it depends on the guy. I think if the guy is capable of getting into the fray immediately, then it's wasteful almost to draft him to a team that doesn't need that.
Yep.
Okay. Talking about the quarterback position, I have heard you about Hendon Hooker is not a good prospect for the Vikings at 23, right? So
Right.
do you think as drafting Hooker maybe in the second, if they trade back maybe to, I don't know, 52, is it a mistake for the Vikings to draft Hendon Hooker anytime in the first or the second round?
I would still say yes. I think that's still too high. He might go that high. And I think whoever does that is making a mistake. I just don't think that he is a quarterback that will work out in the NFL. He has too many flaws and too much experience for those to still be his flaws. I think a lot of people are taking for granted that you can just take any guy, put him in the NFL, and fix whatever's wrong with him. But if he is not throwing accurately, despite the fact that he has had 5 years to hone his mechanics, and his mechanics are good, but the ball doesn't land where it's supposed to, I just don't think he has it. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, and good for him, right? He seems like a good enough guy. Hope he can do well. But if you draft him in the first or second round, you're committed to him. You do not often see a first round quarterback get drafted and then immediately you give up on him and draft another first round quarterback. I think the Cardinals did that, and I struggle to come up with any other examples in the last, 10 years. But the way NFL teams approach this, they pick their quarterback, they want their guy, they take him, and then that's their guy. And any wishy-washy, any indecisiveness is just going to undermine the confidence that your players have in you as an organization, which will come out on the field. No question about it. I think if you're going to spend a first round pick on a quarterback, that's your quarterback for the next 4 years, with very limited exception. So you better be okay with that dude being the quarterback. Franchise dude. He can't hit quick game. He can't throw screens reliably. He can't hit wide open post routes. Is that your guy for the next 4 years? Sounds to me like you're taking a first round pick to get a lot worse than Kirk Cousins. A lot worse than Kirk Cousins. Saving a little bit of cap space, and ultimately you're probably going to lose less games than if you gave Kirk Cousins a 5-year extension. And I would rather give Kirk Cousins a 5-year extension than draft Hendon Hooker in the first round. And if you know me, I'm not the biggest Kirk Cousins fan. But if those were my two options and the devil approached me and said 5-year Kirk Cousins extension or Hendon Hooker in the first, I'm hitting the Kirk Cousins button a million times before I hit the Hooker one.
Okay. So you are not a big fan of DTR, right?
I'm more conflicted on him. I have a 3rd round grade on him. I have a 4th round grade on Hooker. So if the 3rd round comes around, and I think that makes me a lot higher on Thompson Robinson than everybody else, but he has a lot more of that high ceiling talent that people really talk about for Hendon Hooker, where there's this dream that if Hendon Hooker can just develop, he becomes this amazing quarterback. Thompson Robinson is the guy where if you could just get him to throw accurately more consistently, he becomes a first round quarterback. But he can't do that, and he also was a 5-year starter, so you kind of have to ask the same questions, and that's why he won't go very high. But he has running talent that I think rivals Justin Fields's. Improvisational talent that is incredible. He has a great sense for it. He can see the full field. I think the mental side of his game is complete. He just can't deliver the ball accurately. And it's enough of a problem to sink him all the way to the 3rd, which, I mean, that's where Cody Kessler goes. This guy's not a starter. But I think he's a very cool backup that if Kirk Cousins goes down, he would be a very exciting, electrifying backup that brings a whole new dimension, maybe right in the middle of a game, which could throw a defense for a loop and steal a game where your quarterback goes down. That's a dream, right? To actually win that game. And I think that there is enough hope for him to actually develop that I would feel pretty good about taking him in the 3rd. And I think if you get him on day 3, that's bank robbery.
So maybe pick 119 for DTR is a good range for him, right?
I would love that.
Okay. So Stampede has a question for you. Would you rather trade up for Will Levis in the 1st or Hooker in the 3rd? I think the answer is pretty obvious, right?
Definitely trade up for Will Levis. If they trade up and take Will Levis, I think I would really softly disagree with it. But I understand it. That's where I am with Levis. I don't think he has a very good chance to become better than Kirk Cousins. I would rather roll with Kirk Cousins than roll with Will Levis. But if they traded up for him and they decided to do that so that they don't have to pay for a quarterback anymore, pay all that money to a quarterback anymore, I would certainly understand and sympathize with it, even though it's just not what I would do if I were in charge.
Yeah,
okay.
It's that you think that Levis is going to be like in some way like Cousins, no? Like they have to have all around him to make him look like a good QB.
Yes.
instead of by himself prove that it's valuable.
Yeah. And I think the argument would be, now that we're not paying $40 million to a quarterback, we can make it perfect around you. But I think that's naive. Cap space does not a roster make, and it's very difficult to get. There's a lot of teams every year that have a lot of cap space. There are very few teams throughout the history of the league that have given their quarterback perfect surroundings.
Okay, Pablo, do you have any questions? A comment for Luke? No.
Well, with the Mas, I going to ask about the wide receiver situation. O sea, I think the wide receiver situation is a big need to address because of the exit of Adam Thielen, but I don't know if you agree with this or not. Do you think it's a big address to a big need to address in the draft? Maybe in the first round, maybe Jackson Smith-Njigba, say Flowers, one of those prospects that
if
can fall.
If Smith-Njigba falls to pick 23, that would be a fantastic pick for the Vikings. I think he's going to go before that, but anything can happen. It is a huge need for sure. They have Justin Jefferson, KJ Osborne, and a whole bunch of guys you can't even guarantee will make the roster. They also only have 5 receivers under contract right now. They need to bring at least 9 into camp, and preferably 10 or 11 into camp. So they're going to acquire a lot of receivers. And I don't think you're going to see an undrafted free agent class with 6 wide receivers in it. They'll draft some. It fits the first round, maybe. I think there are some interesting names in the second or third round if they end up picking in that range enough. There are still interesting free agent names out there that they may acquire after the draft. I wouldn't expect a lot of something interesting before the draft, but afterwards, there are still a lot of good wide receivers out there that can absolutely make a team and be a contributor. They wouldn't be your wide receiver 2, but they can be someone. And I think it's going to take all of those arms. They need 4, 5, 6 more warm bodies in the room. I think a first round pick for wide receiver is absolutely on the table. If they miss out on quarterback and they don't, trade that first round pick up to go take their quarterback, I could very much see trading back into the second round, picking up another day 2 pick in doing so, and using those 2 picks on a wide receiver and cornerback.
So maybe that guy should be Josh Downs, Cedric Tillman. What guy do you think is like a scheme fit for what O'Connell wants to play in this new Shanahan scheme?
Yeah, I am actually in the middle of watching Josh Downs right now, so I'll withhold comment. I don't really know how I feel about him yet. I think Zay Flowers is pretty good. I really like him, and I think he's a second round kind of guy. I don't like Cedric Tillman very much. I think that Tennessee offense is one that feels like it's designed to trick you into thinking bad players are good. So it's same thing with Hendon Hooker a little bit. I think everybody made a lot of mistakes on that Tennessee offense, and I'm very concerned about how those players translate into the NFL. Jonathan Mingo is an interesting name. I think Ole Miss, A.T. Perry out of Wake Forest is an interesting name. That are all guys that that really can be positive impact NFL players with big roles that you don't necessarily have to spend your first round pick on if you decide to trade back, day 2 kind of guys. There's a decent glut of day 2 guys. And if they don't pick one in the first round, I think the difference this year between the first round guys and the second or third round guys is smaller than it usually is. Those first round guys are more like second round guys that just look good because they're surrounded by a bunch of third round guys.
Okay, so there is also a guy, Mims from Oklahoma, that is also a name to watch, right? And talking about these kind of prospects, also in the defensive side of the ball, do you have any favorite prospects like you really, really, really like? I heard you like a lot Joey Porter Jr., right?
Mm-hmm.
But maybe you are not that high on Christian Gonzalez because of the scheme fit, no, the cover three, and maybe those things that may not translate good in what the Vikings could really be playing defensively, right? Right. So,
Sure.
do you have any names that maybe you could be high on in terms of what they could look in a Vikings scheme?
Yeah, Devin Witherspoon is my favorite corner in the class. I don't think he gets past pick 7, so a little bit of a dream there. Same with Joey Porter. I don't think he makes it to the Vikings, but if he does, that would be maybe one of my favorite possible outcomes in the entire scope of the draft. I love Joey Porter Jr. Christian Gonzalez is another one that just doesn't seem realistic. His scheme fit with the Vikings, I think, is worse than his scheme fit with other teams. But I do want to be clear. He can do what the Vikings would ask him to do. I think he's just better at other stuff. That he'll be a better asset to a team like Philadelphia or Seattle. But that doesn't mean he'd be a bad asset here. I just think those teams are going to want him more, and he's probably going to go to Seattle or Philadelphia or one of those teams in the top 10. Cam Smith out of South Carolina is a name that I think people should get to know. I think that's a very likely first round pick for the Vikings. He's got a great build. He's big. He is a pretty polished corner with a holding issue. And that's really the biggest thing, is that he likes to reach out and tug and grab, and in not a very productive way. Deonte Banks is another name I'm not as high on as everybody else, but he is absolutely somebody you can get to know. He is somebody that I put in the second roundish range with, he's got a lot of physicality and he's got a good body to play cornerback. I just think he's a little bit rawer than everybody gives him credit for, but that's not a catastrophe. And taking him in the second round and starting him day one, I still think is feasible. There's also Clark Phillips, who is very small, but incredibly polished. He reminds me a lot of Trent McDuffie, who came out last year. I really like him as well. All three of those names, I think, can be day one starters. And because of the first three corners off the board are all so elite, all the teams that need corners might get them by taking Devin Witherspoon and Porter and Gonzalez. And now we can kind of have our pick of all the rest of the guys, because, the Seahawks, they got their guy. The Eagles, they got their guy. They're out of that market now, and now we can take whoever we want. There's just so many corners in this draft. I think there's about 8 guys that I would be happy to see in purple. I love this cornerback class.
Okay, we got a question for you. Andre Yusibas seems like a sleeper in the draft. What do you think about him? Cheers from Valencia, Cali.
I do not have much familiarity with him at all. I'm really sorry. I can't answer this one. I haven't researched him or watched him at all, and I don't want to make it up.
Okay. Getting in the cornerback discussion, how would you address this need? So maybe you could bring in a guy like Rock Yassin. You could draft maybe 2 guys, like one in the first, one in the 5th. What would Luke do to address this big need? Because we already know that Brian Flores needs not only players at the corner, he needs good players, right? So what would you do to address this urgency need?
Yeah, I want to focus on players that have inside-outside flexibility, because Byron Murphy has inside-outside flexibility. And I think that there is an opportunity for the Vikings to be a full-on shadow man coverage team, which means you decide going into the game, you got that guy, you got that guy, you got that guy, and follow them all around the field. Deny the offense. A lot of offenses these days are designed to set up matchups, to get George Kittle on a slot cornerback, to get Justin Jefferson on a linebacker. Deny that. and say, no, Byron Murphy is going to follow your best receiver around all day long. You can put him anywhere you want. Our guy can play there. And if all of our players can play inside and outside, there's nothing the offense can do to get the matchups that they want. And I think that can be pretty potent. That's what I want to focus on. We don't have a lot of control over how the draft board falls. So we need a lot of options. If it turns out that they can get 2 corners, they can pick Deontay Banks and Clark Phillips, I'm in favor of that. I would pick Clark Phillips and then maybe do other stuff for the rest of the draft. Grab a wide receiver, like Pablo said. Grab some other defensive players. Maybe, there's quarterback maneuvering in there, and you get Clark Phillips as a secondary thing. And then after the draft, you look up and say, well, Bryce Callahan's on the market. He has a lot of veteran experience. He's a little long in the tooth, but he can play inside. And maybe we can go for that from there. At any rate, I think the Vikings are currently 2 starting players short. And they also similarly are 5 total players short of having a complete camp roster. So there's also probably going to be some late round corners, maybe a 7th rounder or something. Or I think they don't have a 7th rounder right now, but they probably will. Or undrafted free agents, or grabbing players out of the XFL, trying to find guys in the bargain bin that are there. There are a couple of players on the San Antonio Brahmas right now that are really, I think, NFL quality corners that can come in and try to make your team. There's a lot of different ways to do it. And I think for me, focus on inside outside flexibility. And from there, do whatever you can. It's a bad situation. So leave yourself open to a lot of options and a lot of different ways to do it. And, strike when the iron's hot.
Okay. Just a final question. You upload some videos about scouting, right? Scouting wide receivers, scouting corners. So I personally think that the defensive line is a huge need. I think that Harrison Phillips and Dean Laurie are not a good group. Maybe also getting there, Tonga, Lynch. I think that's not enough, right? So I'm curious to know what are the things you focus on when scouting a defensive lineman, and do you have any prospects? Maybe Kalijah Kancey, Brian Breezy, Massey Smith. I think he would be a very good pick for the Vikings. But do you have any names on the defensive line up front?
Yeah, I am not very familiar with the defensive line class, so I'll leave that to you guys. But I do like that Massey Smith name. He's quite the freak. But I'll tell you what I look for. With Brian Flores, I think it's more likely than some people are giving it credit for that Davenport, Danielle Hunter, and Zadarius Smith are all on the field at the same time as a default state. And then you have Harrison Phillips, and maybe you rotate Tonga or Lynch or whoever, Dean Lowry, as kind of a 5th guy, but you're going with 3 edge rushers because you want these guys to rush inside. I don't think that's that crazy of a thing to imagine. A little bit weird versus the run, but that's a different conversation. Again, with the draft itself, I apologize. I'm not that familiar with them. I've been focusing more on the wide receivers and cornerbacks and quarterbacks. But I would love to see them get another defensive tackle. But they do have that defensive line room is almost as many people as they usually take into camp. So I do not believe that they have an intention to. Now, if Kalijah Kancey is there and they're picking in the 50s, and you just are like, well, okay, this guy's insane. I can't believe he fell that far. Do it. But I'm not sure that is currently a high priority part of their plan. But who knows? The draft falls a whole bunch of weird ways. Maybe they will.
Or maybe they are high on Otomehu, right? A very interesting name from last year's.
Too.
Maybe. Pablo, Marcelo, do you have any final questions for Luke?
Nope.
No.
Just back on topic with the corners. What's happening with Keller Ringo? Because back in December, some reporters say that he is one of the best cornerbacks in the in the class maybe, and now some reports say that he had to move from safety maybe,
No.
uh, to play in the NFL. I don't know if he is really overrated in this class. What are your thoughts in this topic?
His athletic testing hurt him really, really bad. He ran a good 40. He ran a 4.36, I think, and he was expected to run that fast. And that was part of the reason why during the college season, as you watch the Georgia defense be incredible, and he's the best corner on the Georgia defense, so you think, well, this guy's got to be really good, right? But as he tested, he did very poor in the agility part of it. He did very poor in the explosion, the jumps. He jumped 33 inches. That's really bad for a corner that is supposed to be, his size and his wingspan and all that. That's really bad. And I think it gets people to sort of re-question, does this guy have the short area quickness to play cornerback at a high level? And you flick the tape back on and you see that he does not. It's kind of like if DK Metcalf had to play slot corner. It's just not the kind of athlete that he is. And maybe that's why people say he should move to safety. I'm not sure that works either. But he is really struggles with short area quickness. If you get him going one way, whether it's getting him to turn and run backwards and then he has to cover a comeback, whether it's getting him to break on something inside and then he has to chase the ball outside, it's a lot of work and a lot of time for him to come all the way to a stop and then accelerate back up the other way, as evidenced by his 3-cone, which is bad. And I think that is causing people to say, all right, maybe we'd rather have, Gonzalez or Witherspoon or Porter or Clark Phillips or DJ Turner or there's like 8 other guys that I think, that don't come with that problem, that have plenty good 40 times. And some of them even have pretty good body types. And it becomes hard to find a reason to take Keely Ringo over those guys. When Ringo was like the second guy I watched in this class, and I came away with a 3rd round grade on him before I even saw his athletic testing. But I sort of thought, this guy doesn't have a lot of explosiveness. I wonder if he'll be able to jump high in the vertical. And then it turns out that he couldn't. And I think that confirmed my concerns. I don't think that Keely Ringo is currently a starting quality cornerback in the NFL. And I am concerned if he can ever become one because of those athletic deficiencies.
Okay, now before we go, can you please tell us a bold prediction? Like maybe from the Vikings from first round, any bold prediction you may have. Now it's April the 4th. So what do you think? A crazy prediction. What can you tell us?
Bold prediction. It might be a bold prediction that Dorian Thompson-Robinson goes above Hendon Hooker. That is certainly against consensus. I don't think it's quite spicy enough. So give me a second to think.
Okay.
I think the Vikings, they have one day 2 pick right now in the 3rd round. I think they select 3 times in day 2.
Okay. Maybe one in the 2nd and 2 on the...
Yeah. Maybe that means they don't select in the 1st round at all. I don't think that that's out of the question, but I think they pick 3 times in day 2. There's my spicy take.
Okay, so thank you, Luke, for being with us. I'm going to start speaking in Spanish, so thank you for being with us. Si ustedes tienen posibilidad de ver lo que hace Luke en Locked On Vikings, se los recomendamos muchísimo. Como ya dijimos, hace podcast diarios. Síganlo también y apóyenlo en su página de Patreon. En Patreon hace cosas muy interesantes, videos sobre prospectos. Hace poquito hizo uno de Will Levis. Les digo, hace contenido gratuito. También tiene apariciones en otros lados y pues en Twitter está muy activo, ¿no? Así que pues eres uno de los principales creadores de contenido de los Vikings. Es un ejemplo a seguir, ¿no? Para muchas personas. Así que, pues Marcelo, Pablo, ahora sí, no sé si tengan ahora sí un último comentario antes de despedirnos.
Well, thank you very much, Luke. It was very, very interesting talking with you about this off-season and the draft coming in the next days. We're still following you in your project, like Locon Vikings and everything you do. It's like very inspirational for us.
Thank you.
Okay. I also wanted to thank you. I think that you are a very good content creator. And I also wanted to know if you have already done something like this in Spanish with any other Vikings fans, or is this your first time?
I don't think so. I think I have gone on other Spanish-ish speaking shows, but
Okay.
I will say there's not enough Spanish-speaking Vikings content. I think there's a very hungry audience in the southern part of the world and in Spanish-speaking parts of America. So I think this is really cool what you guys are doing.
Thank you. Pablo, ahora sí unas últimas palabras.
Thank you, Luke, for being here with us. Yes.
Bueno, pues,
Buenas noches.
maybe, can you say a little phrase? We before quitting before ending our streams, we say nos vemos en febrero. That means see you in February, because we think that the Vikings will get to the Super Bowl. So can you say that phrase, please?
Yeah, nos vemos en febrero. Let's do it.
Really, thank you. We appreciate your time. And pues nada, muchísimas gracias. Sigan a Marcelo en sus redes sociales, sigan a Pablo, sigan a Informe Púrpura. Y también, como les dije, sigan a Luke, está muy activo. También luego participa en Locked On NFL. Entonces, ahí síganlo. Muchísimas gracias. Y pues nos vemos en el siguiente stream, amigos. Que tengan una buena noche. Thank you, Luke. Have a good one. And see you later.